We discussed that last time.
What is that word again? A legal fiction.
Exactly, a legal fiction. There was a very interesting lecture by a German journalist. And I think he did an amazing job. Now, I don't want to repeat his lecture.
No.
But it provided a lot of food for thought.
Yes.
It was very carefully worked out. It was very well documented. It didn't have any conspiratorial flavor. It was just a number of facts in the right
factual
sequence.
Exactly.
And I think it would be appropriate if we looked at this issue from this viewpoint and just get an idea of whether there has been a long time of planning to set the current things in motion. His name was Paul Schreier, and he wrote about pandemic Planspiele, planned games, the preparation for a new era. So, what does he say? You have translated it here. Politics and the corona crisis did not come out of the blue. The fight against viruses began as early as the 1990s as the fight against bioterror. So there have been a number of movements preparing for what is happening now.
Yes.
Research shows for more than 20 years since then, pandemic scenarios have been rehearsed again and again in business games, first in the United States, later coordinated internationally, also with German participation. And the title of these exercises are reminiscent of Hollywood productions. In other words, what these people would do is they would enact the pandemic. And these were not regular actors.
No.
These were high government officials that were actually involved in government in these types of things. Right.
And current at the time. And
yes.
All sorts of different ones.
So the ones that they were enacting as preparations, the one was titled Dark Winter, and that was in 2001. Then Global Mercury, that was another enacted scenario, 2003. Then the other one was Atlantic Storm in 2005. Clade X in 2018, and that's a very interesting one, which we will look at. High-ranking officials and government representatives, as well as well-known journalists, were involved, most recently at Event 201 in October 2019, and it's important that this was before the pandemic. Including board members of large global corporations, and after the World Health Organization declared a coronavirus pandemic in 2020, many of the measures that had been tried and discussed for years were implemented globally. That is a fact of history. Passages like this appeared in the script 20 years ago. The sight of an armed military presence in American cities provokes protests against the curtailment of civil liberties. The question is how and to what extent we enforce these things. How much violence do we use to keep people in their homes? In the event of a pandemic, basic civil rights such as the right of assembly or freedom of movement could no longer be taken for granted. Restrictions on freedom, but also mass vaccinations, were a regular part of the simulation games. So this has been practiced over and over again. But not only that, there was certain legislation that needed to be introduced.
Yes.
And this legislation was often in conflict with your basic rights under the constitutions. Now we must understand that in the last one, we spoke about the relevance of the Constitution, which basically has been overridden by maritime law.
Yeah.
Because in actual fact, we're running under a legal system.
But not a lawful one.
But not a lawful
Correct.
system.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Meaning that, if I'm correct, since Lincoln, they walked out of that one. There's been no Congress.
there's been no Congress.
So they could, everything from there on was done under martial law with executive orders.
Exactly. So there is an appearance of government, but you cannot move people from point A to point B with great haste if the differences are too great, right? So you have to do this gradually. So you have to create a crisis in order to introduce legislation that will enable you to do what you finally have to do. So basically what he did is he went through the history of these and showed how legislation was introduced gradually over time. And when there was a bottleneck, then there was a crisis.
Yeah, when there was a resistance,
Then after that, the legislation passed and was introduced. So the content of these exercises was fight against the terror or a political tool since 1919, bioterror simulation games 1999 to 2005, and then they had an operation which was called Lockstep. That means all the nations of the world had to come into harmony and work along the same lines of thinking. So the people that were involved in, let's say, pandemic or health issues in the various countries, they were gathered together and they all partook of these exercises.
Correct.
So this has been planned for a very long time. Then there were the Trump and pandemic exercises from 2017 and the stock market quake in September 2019. So the market is involved.
Mm-hmm.
So if we go through the dates that this man mentioned in his lectures, he said, well, there were various scenarios that happened. In 1990, you had the fall of communism. Now there was no enemy.
Yes.
This is a problem. How do you keep your armies going?
Yeah, how do you justify
How do you justify it?
Mm-hmm.
And so Colin Powell, at that stage, who was the highest ranking one in the military, said, I'm running out of demons. I'm running out of villains. I'm down to Fidel Castro and Kim Il-sung. He said, referring to the leaders of Cuba and North Korea, Powell's comments suggest the Gulf War has not solved the major problem for some Pentagon planners over the past 3 years. How to justify a large army and a nearly 300 billion military budget in the post-Cold War era. Why would you need a big army? Who do you have to control if there is no apparent enemy?
Yes.
So we need enemies. 1993, you had the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center. So now you had an invisible enemy, a terrorist. In July 1994, Clinton published his National Security Strategy of Engagement and Enlargement. March 1995, Joseph Biden, who is now the President of the United States, Chairman of the Judiciary Commission of the Senate, proposed a law to give more power to government and the President in case of a terror attack. And this law was vehemently rejected. And so, in 1995, there was a terror attack in Oklahoma, a decisive moment on issue of terrorism. In 1997, articles in Los Angeles Times written by politicians, not journalists, CIA Director James Woolsey and Assistant Secretary of Defense Joseph Nye, defend against the shadow enemy, the destruction of the federal building in Oklahoma City and the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York shocked Americans. But those tragedies would have been far worse if nuclear, biological, or chemical materials had been involved. So you're creating scenarios.
Yes.
And every time these things happen, new legislation is passed. So everything is in place, right? Now, this can be pure coincidence that it happened like this, but it could also be planned.
Yeah.
We're not taking a position, right?
No, we're just stating
We're just stating
facts.
the facts. Correct. And 1997, Defense Minister William Cohen warns of future chemical and biological warfare at press conference and demonstrates anthrax threat on the breakfast show. So he holds up a little piece of a packet with sugar in it and says this amount will kill this many people.
Now the half of Washington or something, if I can remember correctly.
Exactly. So fear plays a very important part.
It's also important if you maybe go back to the video of that Austin Fitz lady. She mentioned fear.
Yes.
So it just fits in with what she was saying.
Absolutely. In 1998, Homeland Security Biodefense Program Director Robert Cadleck contributes Chapter 9 called 21st Century Germ Warfare in a Pentagon internal strategy paper called Battlefield of the Future, 21st Century Warfare Issues. So now there's an invisible enemy, right?
And now they're going over also to germ warfare and
Correct.
Health.
All right. In 1998, the Center for Civilian Biodefense is founded, and today it's called the Center for Health Security at the St. Johns Hopkins University, funded by the Sloan Foundation. Now, it's interesting that all these foundations are ultra rich foundations.
What's also interesting is that's in 1998.
Yes.
And today, 2021, we still hear these names.
Yes. So they started from 1999 to 2005 with bioterror simulation acts. In 1999, they started with their simulation games. First National Symposium on Medical and Public Health Response to Bioterrorism, sponsored by Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense. And for the first time, the Department of Health and Human Services is part of the national security apparatus of the United States. So now they're beginning to coordinate all of these groups. Then in the 1999 as well, they had the Project Bacchus. Interesting names that they choose, right? Launched in Nevada, covert investigation by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, U.S. Defense Department, to determine whether it is possible to construct a bioweapon production facility with off-the-shelf equipment. See, people said it takes a very specialized laboratory to produce some of these toxins like anthrax, for example. And so they created a laboratory to see whether they could produce it from off-the-shelf products. Well, you could look at that both ways.
It's also important, if I'm under correction, but if I remember correctly, it was done in secret.
Yes, absolutely. It was done in secret. But having been done, and after a lot of experimentation showing that it is possible that you can then say, but bioterrorists got hold of it and did it by using off-the-shelf material. So in 2000, there was a second symposium by the name Epidemic Response Scenario, Decision-Making in a Time of Plague.
So now they're switching a little bit more. Now it's not just biowarfare with anthrax.
Now it's also natural.
Now it can also be like a plague.
Yes. 2001, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney are elected as president and vice president. So this is a long time ago, that this planning has been going on. And in 2001, they had a major bioterror exercise called Dark Winter. And I'm fascinated to see that the current role players are using this terminology, Dark Winter, for the COVID plague.
It will be a very dark winter.
It will be a very dark winter. It could be coincidence. Which was a smallpox exercise sponsored by Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And it took place at Andrews Air Force Base, whereas the previous two were in conference rooms. So now we're moving to the military and incorporating the military, although they'd already set up laboratories, right, in military facilities. September 2001, we have the attack on the Twin Towers. In October 2001, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, who opposed the Patriot Act, received white powder threat letters and gave up their resistance, and the law was passed. So now they have the legislation in place that gives these special powers to the president.
Yeah.
2001, Global Health Security Initiative founded using anthrax letters as justification. In 2002, the health ministers launched initiatives to improve health security globally. Now they test not only for biowarfare, but also flu pandemics. So now they're bringing the natural things in as well, right? Beginning of international level exercises. That's in 2002 already.
Yeah. Previously, it was only America.
Yes.
Now it's universal.
So it's interesting. America always takes the lead, right? 2003, Operation Global Mercury. This was a command post exercise involving the GHSAG nations, plus the World Health Organization and the European Commission, conducted over a 56-hour period between 8 and 10 September. The exercises aim to evaluate the communications protocols between and among these members in the face of an outbreak of an infectious disease. So now it is internationally coordinated. And how do you deal with the media? And all of these things came into play. In 2003 already.
Yes.
2005, they had Operation Atlantic Storm. And Madeleine Albright played the President of the United States. I was always interested in Madeleine Albright because she always had the phoenix rising out of the ashes as one of her brooches.
Okay.
Not about smallpox per se, rather the exercise was designed to highlight the numerous complicated global challenges that would arise in the event of any large-scale epidemic of infectious disease, whether caused by a bioterrorist attack or a naturally occurring outbreak. So they had all of these scenarios. Now these people came together and they role-played.
Yes.
They even had the televisions and the media involved.
Yes.
And they practiced how to get information to the media and how to eliminate all contrary information.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do we see something like that happening today?
Exactly. Exactly.
Isn't that exactly what
censoring somebody that's talking against something? That
yes.
Getting
now, this could all be pure coincidence. It could be. But it does make one think, doesn't it? Okay, in all these exercises, it was not only about a health crisis, who had the sovereignty, it was also about abolition of fundamental rights. They practiced that.
Yeah.
Mass vaccination, authoritarian politics without parliaments. In 2008, there was a financial crisis. Now the economy is going to play a major role in this because the global reset has to do with resetting the economy.
Yes.
If you want to reset the economy, you must first destroy the old system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the United States and of America and many of the Protestant countries in the world, the wealth is in the hands of the people. If you want to reset the economy, you have to shift the wealth to the system.
Yeah.
Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So let's see where this is going to lead. So you have this massive crisis in 2007, 2008. And you know what, Martin? In that crisis, there was a shift from absolute ownership to partnership.
Yes.
The banks and the governments went into partnership to bail out the community, which is basically the definition of fascism.
Correct.
Which is the preferred form of government, according to the Jesuits, of the Roman Catholic system.
Yes.
So it's a form of government where Government and industry go in partnership for the sake of the community to prevent a total collapse. So it seems like a good thing, but now there's no longer a complete private
Sector.
business. It is now private government combinations.
And if you link this to who owns the crown, then you know who swings the scepter and everything.
Correct. Now, you know, in 2009, you then have a swine flu epidemic. So this sweeps across the world, but you don't close everything down. Now, this is very fortuitous that all of these natural epidemics start hitting the world to prepare the people mentally for the big one that is probably coming. And the big one can always become still bigger, right?
Yeah, I remember the World Health Organization saying to us, this is not necessarily the big one.
Exactly. 2010, Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development by Rockefeller Foundation. 4 scenarios, of which one was lockstep scenario, where all the nations come together and have the same approach.
Yes.
A world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. Those are quotes from their documents, right?
Correct.
During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries of communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. That was practiced in 2010. Is this being implemented?
100%.
100%. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. Now, that was just the exercise. It wasn't the reality.
No.
But the reality has come under COVID-19.
We're starting to see it because even now, recently they asked Fauci, why do they still have to wear their masks after they're inoculated? And now there's quite a lengthy few answers that comes to that. But so that just shows the implementation.
It'll always get worse.
It's not going. It's not.
Yes.
Yeah, everything that like this exercise showed, the implementation of certain rules and stuff, it's not going to go away, even if the thing fades.
Exactly. Then we have the presidency of Donald Trump. And everybody says, a breath of fresh air, or the opposite view, this is the worst thing that ever happened to humanity, right?
Yes, the world.
And he's an anti-establishment man, and he says he doesn't want this world coordination. You must put your nation first and let the money flow to the people. And at the same time, he appoints all of the judiciary, the judges. By the way, the judges are all corporation judges.
Yeah.
So they all fall under the system of the straw man control.
This fictional
character.
Yeah.
So the judges are
legal fiction.
Legal fictions. Yes. And they appoint all of these high-ranking Catholic individuals. The system is set in place for a papal agenda. And it is a Hegelian dialogue. I'm speculating now. They will say this is extremely conspiratorial. I'm just adding a little bit to the story. But it fits perfectly. Then you pull the rug out from an enemy, which is called COVID. And immediately, that economy that was with the people is removed from the people. The properties remain, and the people are destitute. 2017, Munich Security Conference. McCain said, I refuse to accept the demise of our world order. So Trump and McCain are at loggerheads.
Yeah.
Bill Gates said we need to prepare for epidemics the way the military prepares for war. We may not know if that weapon is man-made or a product of nature, but one thing we can be almost certain of, a highly lethal global pandemic will occur in our lifetimes. It's as if they're preparing for it, right?
No, well, all these exercises they're definitely preparing.
All right, so whether natural or man-made, that is still the debate with COVID even. Immediately afterwards, the exercises start again in 2017. So May 2017, they have the G20 health ministers met for the first time ever in Berlin, Germany, exercising a pandemic scenario of a mountain-associated respiratory syndrome, which they called the Mars virus. So now all the health ministers of the G20, those are the top economic countries in the world, come together to practice this. Is there a preparation? 2017, funding of International Advisory Board on Global Health, Jeremy Farrar, Wellcome Trust, and Christopher Elias of Gates Foundation are members. These are the richest corporations in the world. We're talking about trillions of dollars. May 2018, Operation Clade X. Exercise scenario, high-ranking elitist sects develop virus to reduce world population. So that's a scenario for conspiracy theorists to go wild on. They're trying to pin this on Bill Gates and all of these issues. We're not interested in any of that. Just looking at the progression.
Yeah, and Thomas Daschle, if I pronounce that correctly, was also part of that, one of those guys that received the anthrax letter. That's
absolutely. So these people are now all involved. These were high-level government officials. In 2019, on the 17th of September, short circuit in the financial system, which nobody really knew about.
No.
Had nothing to do with the coronavirus because that effect came only in January 2020. So in 2019, there was almost a total market crash, which was kept very quiet.
Very quiet.
We'll look at it in a moment. 2019, they have an exercise called Event 201. John Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, a high-level coronavirus pandemic exercise. This is also before the pandemic. And if you look at the role players, Christopher Elias, Gates Foundation, George Gao, Director General, Chinese Center for Disease Control, and all of these important people. So the top level of society in terms of the economic world and the political world were involved. It was like a final practice run. Now, when they practiced that Clade X scenario, they had a trailer, which was an official trailer, showing what the exercises were all about. So it would be interesting to have a look at them, right? Yeah. So let's see what they did.
We are continuing our coverage of a new and deadly infectious disease.
The virus has some genetic elements of the Nipah virus.
The care of these patients requires extraordinary effort.
We cannot and will not voluntarily take patients from other hospitals.
The creation and intentional release of the Clade X virus.
The impact of not doing something has lots of consequences.
We can't retreat from the rest of the world.
The continuity of government here cannot be overestimated.
Federal quarantine of this scale is unprecedented.
The question everywhere, when will there be a vaccine?
We have got to engage the private sector.
They know that we don't have a vaccine yet. They want vaccines to be prioritized.
I would not want to pull those people back.
And we need on the ground to be able to assure protection of our first responders.
This is a non-starter. I'm going to need these people. I got this feeling in a whole lot of other places.
More than 40 countries are reporting outbreaks, and many more are suspected of having cases.
Leadership requires doing things that are oftentimes unpopular.
This issue has the amazing capacity to be number 11 on anybody's list of 10 most important items.
We have been unbelievably weakened by this crisis.
What the world will look like when it's done is still very uncertain.
Martin, what does that sound like?
I know, 2020.
It sounds like the script for what has happened, right? Now they're saying it's very uncertain what the world is going to look like. I think they know exactly what the world is going to look like, because there is a mastermind behind it, as we looked at in past one, that is absolutely brilliant and coordinated. And he has a representative on this earth to whom he gives his power and his seat and great authority. And he knows exactly where this is leading.
Yes. So it might seem confusion and everything, but like you just said, that will become a marvelous, if I remember that word correctly.
And will your civil liberties be taken away? Will you be forced to accept a moral dictate from the first beast?
Yes.
Will you be deprived of your economic impact? In other words, you won't be able to buy and sell?
Correct.
All of it is in the Bible.
Yeah.
Is this leading up to something that could create that possibility?
I think so.
Here is another article from the German Economic News. Before Corona, EU developed an action plan for comprehensive vaccination of the population. So for 2 years before the corona pandemic, the EU Commission had drawn up a roadmap for vaccination for public health. So is it something that suddenly came upon the world, or has it been a long time coming?
Long time coming.
Now why? Why now? So let us just look at this crisis of 2019. Now, this was all in that journalist's lecture already, but we've added a couple of slides and a couple of documents just to see if we can make sense of this. Now, he showed a graph about the balance sheet of the Fed, the Federal Reserve. And other banks are, of course, also involved, but this one in particular was very interesting. And it shows a graph of the balance sheet. Now, this is actually a graph that you have to look at in reverse. The higher it goes, the worse it gets, right? So the higher it goes, the worse it gets. So in 2008, 2009, when you had that major crash, there was this blip. And the banks had to be bailed out. So in other words, the Fed had to bail out the banks, which means that the papers and guarantees that they got in return increased this balance sheet.
Yes.
So that was a major blip, and it nearly caused a major crash. So they're trying to bring this thing down, and it went down a little bit after the bailout, but then it kept on rising.
Steadily, yeah.
It just kept on steadily rising. In other words, there was a huge outflow of money, and debt increased by trillions and trillions of dollars. And of course, the guarantees in the Fed increased and increased and increased. So this is what we're seeing. It's actually, it looks like a positive trend, but this is very bad news.
This is very bad news, yeah.
So then they had, for a long period, what they called this bubble. And there were attempts to let the air out of the bubble to bring it back down to, manageable levels. And here, after 2018, they started releasing the air out of the bubble. So in 2019, something went terribly wrong, and there was a massive increase. And they increased their repo rate from 2% to 10%. And somehow they contained it without the public being aware of it.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Now, if you go and look at the entire history of the Fed balance sheet, then we can bring this into perspective. Here we have a historic view of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, and we'll see this massive increase just leading up to the Great Depression. Then afterwards there was a decline. Then end of World War II, there was another increase. And then it came down and down and down. And then in 2008, you had this increase.
Yeah.
Now the next one gives us a little bit more information.
Yeah, it shows now how the 2008 crash compared with the Great Depression.
Yeah, so here's the Great Depression. There were the levels then, and here we are now at these levels in the 2008 scenario. And then it continued to rise.
Yep.
Then there was the bubble.
Yes.
Then they tried to release the air out of the bubble. And then in 2019, we had another spike.
Yeah. So if you compare where we are now,
compared to the Great Depression
and 2008, it is
nothing in comparison
to where we are now.
So basically what this graph tells us is that the world's economies are finished. The nations are bankrupt. It cannot be restored. A Great Depression must come. So how do you bring about this restoration? How about
a great reset?
Having a great reset. Would that be a useful way of bringing everything back to square one?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Great Reset, as the World Economic Forum said, there will be no more private property.
Yeah.
That will be taken away.
You will own nothing, you will be happy.
You will own nothing and you will be happy. So the papal system will be introduced. Now, here's the Federal Reserve balance sheet as a percentage of GDP. And again, we see World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and here we see where we are now. The world is ready for a great reset, a new economic program. Now, it wasn't only the Fed, as we can see over here, that was doing this. The other banks, like the Bank of Japan, for example, they were all doing roughly the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a worldwide phenomenon. This is not a United States phenomenon. Here's another